So, welcome to the deep dive. I'm your host, and today we're getting into something that's probably sitting in your kitchen right now.
Hey there. Yeah, it's fascinating because we're talking about living organisms that might literally be older than you are.
Right, microscopic colonies. I mean, people have carried these things across oceans. They've strapped them to their chest in freezing blizzards to keep them alive.
Oh yeah, and legally pass them down in their wills too. It's wild.
It's completely wild.
Mhm.
So today we're not just talking about a bread recipe. We're talking about how you can domesticate a wild, invisible ecosystem right on your kitchen counter.
Which is, a total paradigm shift. I mean, we live in this world of instant gratification and ultra-processed food.
Yeah, exactly. Everything is just open a box, add water, and you're done.
Right. But this process, it forces you to slow down. You have to submit to biological rhythms.
You actually have to respect the biology.
Exactly. You have to understand the deep living complexity hidden inside, just a handful of flour and a splash of water.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We've got a massive stack of source material today.
Yeah, an incredibly dense encyclopedia entry.
So dense, it covers the ancient history, the cellular biology, the organic chemistry, plus the actual physical preparation of sourdough bread.
And we're going to distill all of that into a practical guide for you.
Right, because if you're listening to this, maybe you're staring at a bag of wheat flour right now. You're ready to start your first sourdough starter, but you're wondering what you're actually getting yourself into.
Because if you just mix flour and water and expect it to behave like, I don't know, instant pancake mix,
Yeah.
you're going to be so frustrated.
Oh, totally. It's a living thing.
Yeah. To succeed, you really need to understand the mechanics of what you're raising in that jar.
Okay, so let's jump into the history. Because miners in the 1890s trusted this in with their lives,
They really did.
which is crazy. Because flour and water aren't antifreeze, How does a bubbling paste survive sub-zero temperatures?
Well, to understand that resilience, we have to look at why humans have relied on this wild process for literally thousands of years.
So how far back does this go?
If we look at the archaeological data, they've excavated sourdough bread in Switzerland. That dates back to 3700 BCE.
Wait, 3700 BCE?
Yeah, but the true origins go back even further. They're intertwined with the very dawn of human agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and ancient Egypt.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're talking about the era when humans first stopped hunting and gathering and started actually planting wheat.
Exactly. And that transition from foraging to farming, it required a massive leap in food processing.
Because raw grain is pretty hard to digest, right?
Oh, it's incredibly difficult for humans to digest in its raw state. The ancient Egyptians would grind these grains into coarse flour using stone tools.
Right, making like a basic porridge.
Yeah. And if you mix that coarse flour with water to make porridge and you accidentally leave it sitting out in the warm Mediterranean climate, things start happening. Exactly.
Yeah.
Wild microbes that are just naturally present on the grain begin to ferment it. It spontaneously starts to bubble and expand.
So the very first leavened bread was essentially a happy accident, like just a forgotten bowl of porridge.
A very happy, transformative accident. They realized that baking this bubbled dough created something much lighter.
And softer, right. Plus significantly more digestible than like a dense flat cracker.
Exactly. And it wasn't just an isolated regional trick. The Roman author Pliny the Elder wrote extensively about this.
Oh, really? What did the Romans do?
He described how Romans would skim the fermented bran from wheat or soak bran in grape juice for 3 days to cultivate the yeast.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, then they'd form that dough into little patties and dry them in the sun. They could store those patties for a year.
Wait, so they essentially invented the first instant yeast packets.
Basically, yeah. Whenever they needed to bake, they'd just soak a patty in water and use it to rise their fresh flour.
That is brilliant. So for the vast majority of human civilization, this wild fermentation wasn't just some artisanal hipster choice.
Not at all. It was the sole biological engine available to make bread rise. It was the absolute standard.
But things eventually changed. When did we stop relying on the wild stuff?
Well, the technological landscape began to shift in the European Middle Ages. Bakers noticed that brewers' guys making beer or ale had a similar fermentation process happening.
In the beer vats.
Right. A thick, frothy foam would develop on the surface of the fermenting beer. They called this substance barm.
Barm. So bakers just, scooped the beer foam off the top and threw it into their bread dough?
That's the core of it, yeah. Barm was teeming with a very specific strain of brewer's yeast.
And I'm guessing it worked faster than sourdough.
Much faster. It provided a really vigorous rise without the need to maintain a delicate, balanced sourdough culture.
So it handed them a concentrated dose of rising power.
Exactly. It decoupled the baker from having to manage an entire wild ecosystem.
But the real shift, the one that makes genuine sourdough seem so rare today, that happened much more recently, right?
Yeah, during the Industrial Revolution of baking. What's fascinating here is how science fundamentally altered our relationship with our food.
Because of Louis Pasteur, right?
Exactly. In the late 19th century, Pasteur confirmed the germ theory of disease and mapped out the exact mechanics of fermentation.
Because before that, yeast was just kind of this magical, invisible force.
Right, but after Pasteur, scientists actually understood what yeast was on a microscopic cellular level.
And once you can see it under a microscope, you can isolate it.
You can isolate the single, most aggressive, fastest reproducing strain of yeast, and you can culture it in massive industrial vats.
And boom, commercial baker's yeast is born.
Exactly. It allowed for the mass production of bread on an unprecedented scale. Bread went from a daily household chore to a cheap, easily purchased commodity.
Here is where I look at the difference between the two processes. It's like the difference between a living, complex, heirloom tomato plant
Yeah.
that is adapted to its environment over decades and like an assembly line factory clone.
That's a perfect analogy.
The commercial yeast is the clone. It's a monoculture. It just does one specific job-producing carbon dioxide to inflate the dough, and it does it blindingly fast.
Right, whereas sourdough is the living heirloom. It's an entire ecosystem, not just a single strain.
But taking that further, the industrial clone sacrificed resilience for speed, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Commercial yeast is incredibly fragile when exposed to extreme environmental stress. It needs a very specific temperature range to function.
And that lack of resilience is exactly why people heading into extreme environments absolutely relied on the heirloom sourdough.
Which brings us to the gold rushes.
Yes. This is where the history stops being just about baking and starts being about pure survival.
Exactly. In 1849, during the California Gold Rush, French bakers brought their traditional methods to Northern California.
And the specific environmental microbes in that region interacted with their dough to create the iconic San Francisco sourdough.
Yeah, it was so foundational to the city's growth that the mascot of their local football team is literally Sourdough Sam.
That's amazing. So California nurtured the culture, but the Klondike Gold Rush in 1898 really tested its limits.
Oh, the absolute limits. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have thousands of prospectors flooding into the freezing wilderness of Alaska in northern Canada.
And there are no supply chains, no grocery stores out there.
Right. And a packet of commercial baking soda or early yeast would be ruined instantly if it got damp or froze solid.
Which means conventional leavening was completely useless.
But a wild sourdough starter has an astonishing biological defense mechanism. Extreme heat will denature the proteins and kill the culture, sure.
But freezing ambient temperatures don't kill it.
Exactly. Freezing simply suspends the microbes. They go into a state of deep hibernation.
So as long as you can wake them up, you can still bake bread.
Right. But waking them up in a sub-zero cabin takes way too long when you are actively starving.
Because bread was their primary source of caloric energy.
Yes. So these prospectors devised this brilliant, really intimate solution. They would keep a portion of their active starter in a small pouch.
And they literally wore it.
They literally wore it on a belt or hung on a string right around their necks, tucked inside their heavy goats.
Oh my God. They used their own core body heat as a portable incubator.
They did. Their body heat kept the microbial colony awake, active, and protected from the deadly frostbite temperatures outside.
And they guarded these pouches with their lives, I assume.
They had to. If the starter died, their only source of leavened, digestible calories disappeared. Their reliance on this living dough was so absolute that the veteran miners eventually earned the nickname sourdoughs.
That level of physical dependency on a microscopic colony is wild to me, and it stands in such stark contrast to the modern controversy we see today.
You mean the sourdough issue?
Yeah, our sources highlight this consumer transparency issue documented by the Real Bread campaign.
Right, the sourdough phenomenon. It's a direct result of the industrial baking industry trying to capitalize on the recent artisanal revival of sourdough.
Because traditional sourdough requires time, like a long, slow biological fermentation.
Yeah, often taking 24 to 48 hours. And time is money in a commercial bakery.
So what do they do instead?
Well, in regions lacking strict legal definitions of what constitutes sourdough, Industrial producers will mix a standard, fast-rising dough using that factory-cloned yeast.
And they just bake it in 2 hours.
Exactly. But it doesn't taste sour if you do that.
Right, it just tastes like regular white bread.
So to mimic the ancient flavor, they literally inject artificial sour flavorings or vinegar or a dead dehydrated sourdough powder into the mix.
That's so deceptive.
It is. It tastes somewhat like sourdough, but it hasn't undergone any of the profound biological transformations that a genuine culture provides.
It's an imposter bread. It gives you the flavor profile, but as we are going to explore, it completely skips the cellular breakdown of the grain that actually helps human digestion.
Which is a huge loss.
Okay, so the question is, how does this genuine biological transformation actually happen? We know the miners kept the dough warm, but how exactly does a mix of dead, dry flour and plain water come to life? Let's dive into the microscopic world.
The ecosystem in the jar. To understand this, we have to look really closely at the raw materials.
So just flour and water.
Right. The foundation of a starter, which traditional bakers call a chief, a head, a mother, or a sponge, is just flour and water. But flour is not an inert, sterile powder.
Even though it looks totally sterile when you buy it in a paper bag at the grocery store.
It does look sterile. But wheat grows in an open field, exposed to all the elements.
Right.
So when the grain is harvested and milled into flour, it carries this invisible payload of dormant, wild microorganisms that naturally existed on the outer bran of the wheat berry.
Plus, you're introducing wild yeasts floating in the air of your kitchen and microbes from your own hands when you need it.
Exactly. You basically have this jar filled with dry flour, which is essentially a dormant microscopic zoo.
Okay, so what is the molecular trigger that wakes the zoo up?
The catalyst is hydration. When you introduce water to the wheat flour, it initiates a huge cascade of chemical reactions.
Just from adding water.
Just from water. The most important reaction is the activation of an enzyme naturally present in the wheat called amylase.
Amylase? Wait, we have that in our own saliva, right?
We do, yeah.
It's what starts breaking down a cracker into mush when you chew it.
The exact same principle applies here. Amylase is an enzyme that acts like a pair of chemical scissors.
Okay, scissors? Cutting what?
Cutting starches. The starches in the wheat flour are complex carbohydrates. They're essentially massive, complicated chains of glucose molecules locked together.
And the dormant yeast can't eat that.
No, the dormant wild yeast and bacteria are surrounded by this starch, but they can't eat it. The starch molecules are simply too large for the microbes to metabolize.
I always think of this like locking a mouse inside a bank vault full of gold bullion. The mouse is surrounded by wealth, but it can't eat the gold.
That's a great metaphor. But the amylase enzyme acts as the intermediary. Once it's activated by water, the amylase rapidly chops those massive starch chains down into simple, easily digestible sugars.
Specifically glucose and maltose, our sources noted.
Exactly. And once those complex starches are broken down into simple sugars, the microbial buffet is officially open.
The vault is unlocked, so the sugars are available, and the two main populations in our microbial zoo wake up to feed. The wild yeast and the lactic acid bacteria.
Right.
But how do these two totally distinct groups function together without wiping each other out?
This raises a really important question about resource management in a closed ecosystem. Let's look at the wild yeast first, specifically strains like Castanea humilis.
Okay, the yeast.
The wild yeast consumes the simple sugars and acts as the pneumatic engine of the dough.
By pneumatic engine, you mean it makes the gas.
Right. As a byproduct of metabolizing the sugar, the yeast expels ethanol, which is a type of alcohol and carbon dioxide gas.
And that carbon dioxide is the crucial element for you as the baker. The gas gets trapped within the elastic gluten network of the wheat, inflating thousands of microscopic balloons.
And that is what causes the dough to physically rise. The yeast builds the physical structure.
But the flavor comes from the bacteria, right?
Exactly. The complexity and the defense of the dough come from the other major player. The lactic acid bacteria.
Primarily the lactobacillus family.
Right. While the yeast is inflating the balloons, the bacteria are consuming other simple sugars and fermenting them. Their primary byproducts are organic acids.
And those acids dictate the flavor profile of the bread.
They do. They produce lactic acid, which gives a mild, creamy, yogurt-like sourness, and acetic acid, which delivers a much sharper, vinegar-like tang.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment.
Sure, good.
If I take a bowl of wet flour and I just leave it sitting on my kitchen counter at room temperature for 2 weeks,
Yeah.
instinct tells me that it's just rotting food.
Mm.
I mean, in any other culinary scenario, leaving wet carbohydrates on the counter guarantees a hazardous bloom of black mold, staphylococcus, and food poisoning.
It sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Right. So how on earth is this safe to eat?
You've hit on the most brilliant natural self-defense mechanism of the sourdough process. It's a biological concept known as competitive exclusion.
Competitive exclusion.
Yeah. Remember those organic acids the lactobacillus is pumping out?
The lactic and acetic acids.
Right. As the bacteria endlessly produce those acids, they drastically alter the chemical environment of the jar. The pH level of the dough begins to plummet.
It gets highly acidic.
Very. A healthy, mature sourdough starter stabilizes at a highly acidic pH between 3.8 and 4.5.
For context, pure water is a neutral pH of 7, so dropping down to 3.8 is aggressively acidic.
It's roughly equivalent to the acidity of tomato juice or certain vinegars. And this creates an incredibly hostile, toxic siege environment for outside invaders.
Oh, so the mold can't survive the acid.
Exactly. Almost all the spoilage microorganisms and pathogenic bacteria that cause food poisoning, the ones that would normally rot the wet flour, they simply cannot survive in an environment with a pH that low.
Their cellular structures just break down in the acid.
They do. So the lactobacillus essentially builds an invisible, highly acidic electric fence.
That's so cool. It makes the environment completely toxic to pathogens, but perfectly comfortable for itself.
It secures the perimeter through chemical warfare. And what makes this ecosystem even more elegant is the specific taxonomy of the survivors.
Let's look at the iconic San Francisco sourdough as an example.
Okay, so the dominant lactic acid bacteria in that culture is literally named Fructilactobacillus sanfranciscensis.
They named it after the city.
They did. And it almost always pairs up in a symbiotic relationship with a specific wild yeast called Casixtania humilis.
Why those two specifically? Why are they always together?
Because they have evolved to avoid competing for the same primary food source.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The sanfranciscensis bacteria strongly prefers to metabolize maltose, one of the sugars created by the amylase enzyme.
Right.
But the humilis yeast actually lacks the ability to consume maltose entirely. It relies entirely on glucose and other sugars.
Oh, I love that. They're like roommates eating from the same refrigerator, but one is strictly vegetarian and the other only eats meat.
Exactly. They never fight over the groceries.
That synergy allows them to thrive side by side without exhausting the environment.
It's a perfectly balanced ecosystem.
So, now that we understand the deep symbiotic mechanics of this microscopic colony, the practical question becomes, how do you, as the home baker, actually raise this beast from scratch without accidentally killing it?
Because building a starter from scratch is definitely not instantaneous.
Right. If you just mix flour and water on day 1, you don't magically have a clean, sour, protective ecosystem on day 2. You have to guide it through a really turbulent development phase.
Laboratory studies observing the genesis of a sourdough starter have mapped this exact timeline. It is a process of successive microscopic colonization.
What happens in the very beginning?
During days 1 and 2, the wet flour is populated heavily by atypical environmental bacteria that just happen to be dominant on the grain or in the air.
So, not the good sourdough bacteria yet.
No, we see high levels of bacteria like Enterococcus.
I always compare this phase to the awkward teenage years of the starter. If you smell the jar on day 2 or 3, it does not smell like delicious, tangy bread.
Oh, not at all.
It might smell like old gym socks or rotting cheese or just bizarrely funky, and it bubbles, so people think it's working, but it's the wrong kind of bubbles.
Right. Those off-putting smells are the literal chemical byproducts of those atypical bacteria metabolizing the early sugars. It is totally chaotic.
And this is where most beginners panic and throw the jar away.
Which is the biggest mistake you can make. You cannot give up. You have to continue feeding it. As you push through to days 3, 4, and 5, the environment begins to acidify slightly.
The electric fence is getting built.
Exactly. As the pH drops, those stinky atypical bacteria can no longer survive the environment they helped create. They begin to die off.
Good riddance.
And sourdough-specific bacterial strains begin to emerge and dominate. Finally, by days 5 to 7, the robust, stable lactobacillus strains fully conquer the jar.
And that's when the pH hits that crucial 3.8 to 4.5 window.
Right. The pathogens are entirely locked out, and the smell dramatically shifts from funky and putrid to sweet, yeasty, and pleasantly sour.
So, to get through that chaotic first week and to keep the colony alive for years afterward, you have to initiate a regular schedule of feedings, or what bakers call refreshments.
Feedings are critical.
So, what are the actual mechanics of a feeding? How do you do it?
Well, a feeding is basically an act of environmental management. As the millions of microbes metabolize the sugars, they eventually deplete the food supply in the jar.
They run out of groceries.
Right. Furthermore, they're constantly excreting those organic acids. If left unchecked, the acidity will become so extreme that they will literally drown in their own acidic waste and go completely dormant.
And eventually starve to death.
Exactly. So a feeding is both giving them fresh food and diluting their waste.
Which means you can't just keep adding flour, right? You have to take some out.
Precisely. You must discard a portion of the old, highly acidic starter and introduce a larger volume of fresh flour and fresh water.
The ratio is critical here, right? Our sources mentioned a specific refreshment ratio.
Yeah, if we look at the traditional San Francisco method, bakers use a refreshment ratio where the old starter makes up only about 40% of the new mixture's total weight.
Okay, so less than half is old starter.
Right. The remaining 60% is entirely fresh flour and water. By using more fresh food than old starter, you ensure the pH rises back to a comfortable level and they have enough unbroken starches to last until tomorrow's feeding.
That makes total sense. Now, what about the physical environment of your kitchen? Where should this jar actually live?
Thermodynamics play a huge role here. A scalable culture prefers a warm ambient temperature, ideally between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius.
Which is roughly 77 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. That's quite warm, much warmer than a drafty winter kitchen.
It is. If the environment drops significantly below that, the microbes will drastically slow their metabolism and go to sleep.
And if it gets too hot,
If it gets too hot, you risk denaturing the yeast or encouraging off flavors from overactive bacteria.
Okay, wait. Here is an actionable tip focus that I'm incredibly excited to share.
Oh, the tap water trick.
Yes. Because when I uncovered this in our sources, it felt like unlocking a massive secret. I know dozens of beginner bakers who measure their flour perfectly by the gram, they keep the jar perfectly warm, and their starters still mysteriously die on day 4.
Just turns into gray, lifeless sludge.
Yes, and the culprit is usually coming right out of their kitchen faucet, urban tap water.
The piped municipal water supply is a frequent silent killer of wild fermentation.
Why is tap water so lethal to a sourdough starter?
Consider the fundamental purpose of municipal water treatment. Cities add chemicals like chlorine or chloramines to the water supply for one specific vital reason.
To kill bacteria so the water is safe to drink.
Exactly. It is literally designed to eradicate microorganisms. And your sourdough starter is nothing but a colony of bacteria and yeast.
So when you pour heavily chlorinated water straight from the tap into your flour, you're essentially dropping a chemical weapon onto your fragile ecosystem.
The chlorine bleaches the microbes before they even have a chance to metabolize the sugars.
It's tragic. So if a beginner doesn't want to purchase gallons of expensive bottled spring water every week, how do they get around this chemical weapon?
The solution is elegantly simple, relying on basic chemistry. Chlorine is a volatile gas that is dissolved into the water.
Okay.
If you fill an open pitcher or bowl with tap water and simply leave it sitting uncovered on your kitchen counter for 24 hours,
Just leave it sitting there.
just let it sit there, the chlorine will naturally off-gas and evaporate into the ore.
Oh, wow.
The water becomes completely dechlorinated and perfectly safe to introduce to your microbial colony. It is a zero-cost solution that saves countless starters from an early demise.
That is just brilliant. Okay, so let's assume my starter is robust. I'm using dechlorinated water and the colony is thriving. As the baker, can I actually control the final flavor profile of my bread?
You absolutely can.
Like, if I want an aggressively sour loaf versus a really mild loaf, how do I command the microbes to do my bidding?
You basically step into the shoes of an environmental engineer. You can hack your starter's microscopic output by manipulating its living conditions.
What are the levers I can pull?
The two primary levers you control are hydration, meaning how stiff or liquid the starter is, and temperature.
So what does this all mean for maximum sourness? Let's say I want a loaf that really bites back. A sharp, deeply tangy bread.
To achieve a sharp tang, you need to encourage the bacteria to produce more acetic acid relative to lactic acid.
Because acetic acid is the one that tastes like vinegar.
Right. To force the bacteria down that metabolic pathway, you maintain a stiffer, drier starter.
Meaning you use significantly less water in your feeding ratio.
Exactly. You create a thick dough rather than a loose batter.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, you keep this stiff starter in a cooler spot in your kitchen.
Dry and cold equals sharp and sour.
A drier, cooler environment slightly suppresses overall bacterial reproduction, but forces the existing bacteria to pump out high levels of sharp acetic acid.
And if I want the exact opposite, a very mild, airy loaf with just a subtle, creamy hint of tang.
You pull the levers in the other direction, you maintain a highly hydrated liquid starter, and you keep it in a very warm spot.
Wet and warm.
This environment turbocharges the lactobacillus, but it shifts their metabolic output to heavily favor lactic acid, which provides that smooth, yogurt-like, mild flavor profile.
You are literally adjusting the microscopic factory settings to output different chemicals. That's incredible. Now, are there other hacks people use to manipulate the colony, especially when first trying to capture the wild yeast? Our sources mentioned grapes and potatoes.
Yes. Traditional bakers across the globe have developed countless local methods to jumpstart and strengthen their cultures.
So how did the grapes work?
Because wild yeast naturally colonizes the skins of fruits, a classic method involves tossing a handful of unwashed organic grapes into the initial flour and water mixture.
Oh, so the yeast on the grape skins heavily seeds the dough.
Exactly. It rapidly accelerates the initial fermentation.
And what about basil?
In traditional Greek sourdough preparation, bakers will soak fresh basil leaves in room temperature water, then use that infused water to mix their flour.
That sounds delicious. It introduces specific regional botanic microbes.
Right. Another brilliant structural hack is using the leftover water from boiling potatoes.
Potato water?
Potato water is saturated with highly accessible gelatinized starches. When you use it to feed a starter, it acts like an energy drink for the microbes.
It provides a massive, easily digestible caloric boost to supercharge a sluggish colony. I love that. Okay, so we've hacked the environment, we've fed the colony, and the jar is now vigorously bubbling. It has doubled in size.
It's ready.
If you take a spoonful of this active starter and drop it into a glass of water, it floats.
Ah, the float test.
Because the yeast has trapped so much carbon dioxide inside the matrix of the paste, the float test is a success. It is finally time to bake.
The float test visually confirms that your wild yeast is at peak biological activity. It has the pneumatic strength required to lift a heavy mass of bread dough.
But this transition from jar to oven is where a lot of home bakers get incredibly intimidated. Because baking an artisanal sourdough loaf isn't like baking a box of brownie mix.
Not at all. You don't just pour it into a tin, set a timer for 40 minutes, and walk away.
It requires a multi-stage physical transformation.
You are essentially building architectural structure.
Yeah.
You take a portion of your bubbling starter and mix it with a large volume of fresh flour, water, and salt.
And then begins the long, slow bulk fermentation.
Right. Over several hours, the yeast inflates the dough, and you periodically fold the dough to align the gluten proteins into a strong web.
And right in the middle of this process, our sources introduce a concept called retardation.
Retardation, yes.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive to me. We just spent all this effort keeping our starter warm and cozy, and then retardation tells us to shape the dough into a loaf and shove it into the cold refrigerator for 12 to 24 hours.
I know, it seems contradictory.
Why on earth would we intentionally freeze out our microbes right before baking?
Retardation is perhaps the most crucial technique for developing deep artisanal flavor. And it relies entirely on the differing biological tolerances of the yeast versus the bacteria.
Okay, explain that.
When you place the shaped dough into the cold environment of a refrigerator, the wild yeast, which is responsible for producing the carbon dioxide gas, experiences a massive thermal shock.
It slows its metabolism down to a crawl.
Exactly. The inflation of the balloon essentially hits pause.
So the dough stops rising.
It rises at a glacial pace. However, the lactobacillus bacteria are significantly more cold tolerant than the yeast.
Oh, really?
Yeah. While the yeast is sleeping, the bacteria continue to aggressively metabolize complex carbohydrates and pump out organic acids.
Wow. You are pausing the structural expansion, but you are letting the flavor factory run overtime.
Exactly. By extending the fermentation in a cold environment for 24 hours, the bacteria can develop incredibly complex, profound flavor profiles that simply cannot be achieved at room temperature.
Because if you left the dough at room temperature for 24 hours, the yeast would overinflate the gluten structure until it collapsed into a soupy puddle.
Right. The cold allows flavor to develop without destroying the physical architecture of the bread.
Now, this raises a really practical question. With all these biological variables, temperature sensitivities, varying yeast strengths, long cold ferments, why can't a home baker just dump their active starter into one of those automatic bread machines from the 1990s?
Oh boy.
Like, just push the sourdough button and let the machine handle it.
Because a bread machine represents rigid industrial mechanics and sourdough is wild nature.
They don't mix.
They don't. A bread machine is programmed with unyielding, strict mechanical timers. It's designed to knead for exactly 50 minutes, rest for exactly 60 minutes, and bake for exactly 45 minutes.
And that relies on the absolute predictability of commercial factory yeast.
Right. But wild yeast refuses to punch a time clock.
Wild yeast operates entirely on its own schedule.
Depending on the ambient humidity, the temperature of your kitchen, and the specific strain of yeast in your jar, the dough might require 3 hours to properly rise today. Next week, if it's raining and slightly cooler, it might require 6 hours.
So if a bread machine blindly triggers its baking cycle after 60 minutes and your wild yeast hasn't finished inflating the dough,
The machine will bake you a dense and edible brick. You cannot automate a wild ecosystem. You have to watch the dough, not the clock.
and even if the machine could time the rise perfectly, the actual baking environment inside a bread machine is totally inadequate for sourdough, right?
Completely inadequate.
Which brings us to the ultimate tool of the home baker, the heavy cast iron Dutch oven. Because every beautiful artisanal sourdough loaf you see online is baked inside a massive cast iron pot.
It's a non-negotiable requirement for home bakers.
Why is this specific piece of cookware so critical?
The necessity of the Dutch oven comes down to thermodynamics and the management of steam. Over the long hours of bulk fermentation and cold retardation, the organic acids and enzymes slowly begin to degrade and weaken the gluten structure.
The dough becomes very stretchy, but it loses some of its rigid strength, so the balloon is getting a little fragile.
Exactly. When you finally place that dough into a 500-degree Fahrenheit oven, you are looking for a phenomenon bakers call oven spring.
Oven spring.
As the intense heat penetrates the dough, the wild yeast experiences a final, frantic burst of biological activity. They expel massive amounts of carbon dioxide right before they die.
And simultaneously, the trapped gases inside the dough heat up and rapidly expand.
Right, while the water in the dough turns to steam. This causes the entire loaf to violently expand upward and outward in the first 10 minutes of baking.
It's the grand finale of the pneumatic engine.
But if you just place your naked dough onto a flat baking sheet in a standard home oven, you encounter a massive structural problem.
What happens?
The dry, blistering heat of the oven immediately sears the outside surface of the dough, instantly dehydrating it and forming a hard, rigid crust.
The outside turns to concrete.
Once that hard, dry crust forms, the dough is locked inside a rigid shell. The expanding gases inside have nowhere to go.
So the oven spring is completely stunted.
Exactly, resulting in a dense, heavy loaf. Commercial bakeries solve this by using massive ovens that inject heavy clouds of steam into the baking chamber during those first 10 minutes,
The steam keeps the exterior of the dough wet and highly flexible.
allowing the bread to fully expand like a balloon before the crust finally hardens.
But I don't have a commercial steam injection oven in my kitchen.
Which is exactly why you use a cast iron Dutch oven with a heavy, tight-fitting lid.
Oh, I see.
The sourdough itself contains a high percentage of water.
Yeah.
When you place the raw dough inside a preheated, blazing hot Dutch oven and immediately slam the heavy lid on top.
The water evaporating from the surface of the baking bread gets completely trapped inside the pot.
Yes. It creates its own highly pressurized, steamy microenvironment. That trapped steam constantly moistens the outer skin of the dough, keeping it incredibly flexible.
Oh, that is magnificent. The dough literally steams itself.
It allows the dough to experience maximum oven spring, rising high and fully expanding. Then, after 20 minutes, you remove the heavy lid, allowing the steam to rapidly escape into the kitchen.
And that's when the dry heat finally attacks the expanded dough.
The dry heat goes to work on the fully expanded surface, caramelizing the sugars and creating that coveted, blistered, deeply crunchy crust that a bread machine or a flat pan simply cannot replicate.
But wait, right before you drop that dough into the blazing hot pot, you have to perform one final crucial step: shaping and scoring.
Yes, shaping builds the surface tension, and scoring is essential.
You take a razor blade or a baker's lame and you slice a deep gash across the top of the dough. Is scoring just an artistic flourish for Instagram aesthetics?
The shallow, decorative patterns, like the leaves and wheat stalks, are purely aesthetic. But the primary deep score is an act of functional engineering.
Think back to the sheer violence of the oven spring we just discussed. The dough is expanding rapidly under immense internal pressure.
If you blow up a balloon too fast, it pops.
Right.
If you do not score the dough, That internal pressure will inevitably find the weakest point in the weakened gluten structure and violently explode through it,
The bread will tear open unpredictably.
usually blowing out the side or rupturing through the bottom, resulting in a deformed, ugly loaf with a compromised internal crumb structure.
You are intentionally weakening the roof to control the explosion.
By making a deep, precise cut with a razor blade, you dictate exactly where the dough is allowed to burst open under pressure.
You provide a planned escape route for the expansion.
Guiding the oven spring safely upward, the score is structural insurance.
It's culinary architecture. Okay, so the lid comes off, the crust darkens, and you pull this magnificent, crackling, blistered loaf out of the oven. The smell fills the house. You have successfully baked the bread,
It's a great feeling.
but the journey of sourdough is cyclical. It doesn't end with a finished loaf. You have a choice to make regarding how to keep your microbial colony alive for the next time you want to bake.
Maintaining the unbroken lineage of your culture is the final step. And there are two primary methodologies for continuing the cycle.
How does the first one work?
The first is the most common approach for modern home bakers, reserving a portion of the starter.
This is the mother dough concept, right?
Yes, often called reserving the mother or the chef. When you are mixing your bread dough, you pour out almost all of your active starter into the mixing bowl. But you deliberately leave a small spoonful of the starter clinging to the bottom and sides of your jar.
Just a tiny remnant.
That tiny remnant still contains millions of viable yeast and bacteria cells. You simply add a fresh ratio of flour and water to that remnant, stir it up, and place it back in the refrigerator.
So the microbes populate the new flour, and the jar is ready and waiting for your next bake.
Exactly. If maintained this way, a mother dough can live indefinitely.
What is the second option?
The second approach is widely practiced in rural Europe and is known as the French levain technique. In this workflow, you do not keep a dedicated jar of wet, bubbling starter in your refrigerator at all.
Wait, then where do the microbes live between bakes?
They live in the bread dough itself. On baking day, you mix your entire volume of active starter into your massive batch of flour, water, and salt. You knead it all together into a large mass of raw, unbaked bread dough.
Okay.
Then, right before you divide and shape that dough into individual loaves to bake, you simply reach in and pinch off a fist-sized piece of the raw, mixed dough.
You steal a chunk of tomorrow's bread.
Exactly. You set that piece of raw dough aside in a covered bowl. Because it is fully inoculated with your culture, it acts as the seed for your next bake.
And when you want to bake again, you take that piece of old dough, dissolve it in water, and use it to ferment your new batch of flour.
It fundamentally maintains the exact same continuous biological lineage, but it utilizes a stiffer dough-like preferment rather than a liquid batter in a jar.
That really emphasizes how this is an unbroken, living chain stretching backward in time.
It's beautiful, really.
And while we've been focusing heavily on standard white wheat flour, the principles of wild fermentation aren't restricted to modern wheat. The world of sourdough is incredibly broad, and this is where we see that harnessing wild microbes is a universal human technology.
Oh, absolutely. The biological mechanics we've discussed apply to virtually any complex carbohydrate. In fact, utilizing unbleached wholemeal flours or flours containing a high percentage of the outer grain bran actually provides a much richer environment for your culture.
Because whole grains retain a vast array of naturally occurring microorganisms and complex minerals that get completely stripped away during the refinement process of white flour.
Right, and we see cultures all over the globe exploiting this.
Like in Ethiopia, the foundational staple there is injera, an incredible, spongy, highly fermented flatbread.
Yes, injera relies entirely on a sourdough fermentation process, but it is made from teff flour, an ancient grain native to the Horn of Africa.
And if you look at the culinary traditions of South India, staples like idli and dosa are created through a robust sourdough fermentation.
But instead of wheat, the microbial colony is fermenting a wet batter of ground rice and black gram lentils. The microbes adapt to the carbohydrate source provided to them.
Whether you are in Addis Ababa, Chennai, or a kitchen in Ohio, you are tapping into the same fundamental human tradition.
It's a global phenomenon.
But when we look at certain specific grains, particularly rye, sourdough stops being just a traditional flavor preference and becomes an absolute structural necessity. This piece of food chemistry absolutely blew my mind.
The chemistry of rye bread is a perfect illustration of how critical the acidic environment of sourdough truly is. To understand this, we have to look at the architecture of the grain.
Okay, so with wheat flour, it contains high levels of gluten proteins. When hydrated and kneaded, those proteins form a strong, elastic web.
Right. That gluten web traps the carbon dioxide gas and provides the physical structural framework of the bread.
Wheat builds its house out of flexible steel beams. What about rye?
Rye flour is fundamentally different. It contains very little gluten-forming protein. It cannot form an elastic web.
So how does it hold together?
Instead, to hold its shape and trap gas, rye bread relies almost entirely on the complex starches within the flour. During baking, these starches absorb water and gelatinize, binding together to form the solid crumb of the loaf.
So rye builds its house out of starch, not steel beams.
Correct. But here is the biological catch. Remember our chemical scissors, the amylase enzyme.
The enzyme that chops up complex starches into simple sugars so the yeast can eat them, yes.
Rye flour naturally contains exceptionally high levels of a specific highly aggressive variant of amylase.
Oh, okay.
Now, in standard wheat bread, when you place the dough into a 500-degree oven, the intense heat rapidly denatures and destroys the amylase enzyme.
It effectively melts the scissors, stopping the chopping process so the remaining starches can solidify the bread. The heat turns off the enzyme.
In wheat, yes.
Yeah.
But the specific amylase found in rye flour is incredibly heat resistant. It can survive and remain highly active at baking temperatures approaching the boiling point of water.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
So if the architectural structure of the rye bread relies entirely on intact starches to hold it together, and the amylase scissors survive the heat of the oven,
You face a catastrophic structural failure.
wow.
If you attempt to bake a 100% rye loaf using fast-acting commercial baker's yeast, the bread will expand in the oven. But as it heats up, that superactive, heat-resistant rye amylase will go into overdrive.
It aggressively chops up all the structural starches that are desperately trying to hold the bread together.
The entire internal architecture of the loaf will completely collapse inside the oven. You will pull out a dense, gummy, inedible, mushy brick.
The heat doesn't stop the chainsaw, and the chainsaw cuts down the house while it's being built.
Exactly.
So how does traditional Danish rugbrød, which is this dense, beautiful rye bread, actually exist? How does sourdough save the day?
The magical intervening factor is extreme acidity. Remember the invisible electric fence created by our lactobacillus.
The pH dropped to 3.8.
That extreme acidity accomplishes what heat cannot. The highly acidic environment of a mature sourdough starter chemically alters the shape of the heat-resistant rye amylase, effectively inactivating it.
The acid turns off the chainsaw.
It does. By drastically lowering the pH of the dough, the sourdough colony suppresses the enzyme's ability to break down the starches during the baking process.
That is astonishing.
This allows the rye carbohydrates to safely gelatinize and set properly into a firm, sliceable loaf.
So in the world of rye, sourdough isn't just an artisanal flavor profile, it is a rigid architectural requirement. Without the bacterial acid, the bread literally cannot exist.
The bacteria alters the chemical environment so the physical bread can survive the thermal trauma of the oven.
And speaking of altering chemical environments, there are profoundly compelling health implications to this whole process as well. We briefly touched on how sourdough skips the biological transformation. What exactly is genuine sourdough doing to the grain that benefits the human body?
Modern nutritional science is continuously validating what ancient cultures understood intuitively. We know definitively that the long, slow, 24-hour fermentation of genuine sourdough structurally alters the grain in ways that fast-acting commercial yeast simply does not have the time to accomplish.
Give us a primary example.
A great example involves compounds known as phytates, or phytic acid.
I've heard phytates referred to as anti-nutrients in health circles. What exactly are they?
Phytates are naturally occurring antioxidant compounds found heavily in the bran of whole grains. From the plant's perspective, they are beneficial, helping to store phosphorus for the growing seed.
But from a human digestive perspective, they present a major obstacle.
Very much so. In the human gut, phytic acid acts like a chemical magnet. It strongly binds to essential dietary minerals present in the bread, specifically iron, zinc, magnesium, and calcium.
So the bread contains iron and zinc, but the phytates lock them up.
Exactly. Because humans lack the necessary digestive enzymes to break those phytate bonds, the essential minerals remain locked away and simply pass through our gastrointestinal tract completely unabsorbed.
You eat the minerals, but your body cannot access them. It's like swallowing a locked safe full of cash. You have the money inside you, but you can't spend it.
That's spot on.
How does sourdough pick the lock?
Through the precise mechanism of acid hydrolysis, the lactobacillus in the sourdough culture produces an enzyme called phytase. And crucially, The highly acidic environment created by the lactic acid creates the perfect optimal pH for that phytase enzyme to activate.
So during the long, slow fermentation, the phytase systematically attacks the phytic acid.
Breaking its chemical bonds and unlocking the trapped minerals.
It pre-digests the anti-nutrients for us.
It fundamentally hydrolyzes the phytates before the bread ever enters your mouth. Studies demonstrate that a prolonged sourdough fermentation can degrade phytate levels by up to 90%,
Wow.
which significantly increases the bioavailability and human absorption of those crucial trace minerals.
That is a staggering nutritional upgrade. And the sources also highlighted a significant impact on blood sugar, right?
Yes, clinical studies have repeatedly shown that genuine sourdough bread possesses a significantly lower glycemic index compared to bread leavened rapidly with commercial yeast.
Because the aggressive bacterial activity and the presence of organic acids fundamentally alter the structure of the carbohydrates.
Right, slowing down the rate at which human digestive enzymes can break the starches into glucose. This results in a much slower, steadier, and more manageable release of sugar into the bloodstream.
Avoiding those sharp insulin spikes associated with highly processed white breads.
Exactly.
So not only does the bacteria protect the dough from rotting, and not only does it provide the architectural integrity for rye to bake, but it actively modifies the molecular structure of the food to make it vastly more compatible with human biology.
It is truly a transformative ancient technology, a profound symbiosis between human agriculture and wild microbiology.
Well, this has been an absolutely unbelievable journey. We started by uncovering the ancient, spontaneous origins in the Fertile Crescent and the excavations in Switzerland.
We followed the desperate prospectors guarding their living pouches of dough against the freezing death of the Klondike gold rush.
We dove deep into the microscopic siege warfare happening in a glass jar, mapping out the brilliant division of labor between the pneumatic engine of the wild yeast and the acidic electric fence built by the lactobacillus.
We explored the thermodynamics of cast iron Dutch ovens, the functional engineering of scoring dough, and the acid hydrolysis that unlocks the nutritional profile of the grain.
It is genuinely staggering when you step back and consider the sheer stubborn resilience of these microbial colonies. The sources we reviewed specifically mentioned the famous Carl Griffith starter.
Ah, yes.
This is a sourdough culture originally cultivated by pioneers on the Oregon Trail in 1847. That specific colony of microbes has been kept alive, fed, and continuously passed down from generation to generation for nearly 2 centuries.
There are living cultures sitting in refrigerators right now that have vastly outlived the humans who originally mixed the flour and water.
They are living, breathing inheritances. As long as humanity continues to provide them with fresh flour and water, they will endure indefinitely, continuing to offer their transformative capabilities.
It really changes how you look at a loaf of bread, doesn't it?
It completely changes it. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final mind-blowing concept to ponder the next time you walk into your kitchen and look at a simple bag of flour in your tap water.
Oh, this is a good one.
Sourdough is not a static recipe. It is literally a microscopic reflection of your physical environment. The wild airborne yeast present in the specific airflow of your kitchen, the unique microflora currently living on the skin of your own hands. As you mix and knead the dough, those specific localized microbes inevitably enter your starter.
They become permanent residents of the colony. You are capturing a completely unique, localized ecosystem that exists nowhere else on Earth.
Which means if you were to establish a thriving starter today, split it perfectly in half, keep one jar on your counter, and mail the other jar to a friend completely across the country.
Even if you both diligently fed your respective jars the exact same brand of flour with the exact same hydration ratio for an entire year,
they would eventually evolve into 2 completely different biological entities. The differing ambient yeasts, the different bacterial strains in your respective homes, would alter the dominant taxonomy of the jars. The bread you bake would taste fundamentally different from the bread your friend bakes.
it's an environmental fingerprint.
Exactly. When you pull a loaf of sourdough out of your oven, you aren't just baking bread. You are consuming a physical, microscopic fingerprint of your own home and your own hands. It doesn't get more personal or more deeply magical than that.